All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we may as well go ahead and get started. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Deputy Director for the Asia Program here at the Wilson Center, and I'm also the Senior Associate for South Asia. For those of you that may be here for the very first time, just a very quick word about what the Wilson Center is and what we do. We're chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We serve as the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. It's a bit of a mouthful. In the spirit of President Wilson, the only U.S. president to have held a PhD, as I'm sure you all knew, we build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy to inform and develop solutions to the nation's problems and challenges. So our topic today is the U.S. India relationship. And I would argue that the world has experienced so many revolutions in international affairs, so to speak, over the last year, or really over the last year and a half. You know, U.S. relations with some long-standing allies have taken some pretty dramatic turns for the worse. U.S. relations with some long-standing enemies have taken some dramatic turns for the better. The role of the U.S. in the world now faces a lot of questions that it really has not faced for a number of decades. So there's really a lot that's changed in international relations. But I would argue that the one thing that has quietly remained the same amid all of this tumult in international affairs is the U.S.-India relationship. For several decades, as you all know, there's been a fairly broad bipartisan consensus in Washington in favor of a strong and sustained U.S.-India partnership. And that sentiment has really not changed under the Trump administration. I think it's quite clear that the U.S. government, the current U.S. government is very keen to deepen a bilateral relationship that's grown pretty significantly ever since the early 1990s. It's certainly not a perfect relationship. There are some considerable tension points, particularly on the economic side, which I would describe as the closest thing to an Achilles heel in the relationship. But it's a pretty strong relationship, and particularly on the security side. And there are some very sharply convergent interests when it comes to the issue of terrorism and how to combat it. And this brings me to the subject of our discussion today, which is U.S.-India counterterrorism cooperation. From the U.S. side, there is a lot of enthusiasm about the scope of partnership in this regard. A few months back, the U.S. counterterrorism coordinator, Nathan Sales, said, and I quote, "India is an incredibly important, incredibly valuable, and incredibly close counterterrorism partner of the U.S." So that's a lot of use of the word incredibly. But setting hyperbole aside, I think there's ample potential and very real progress here. So for instance, there's an ongoing India-U.S. counterterrorism joint working group. It held its 15th meeting in New Delhi in March. There's been information sharing about terrorist threats and terrorist financing. There are also efforts in place to partner together on the issue of terrorism-related designations. And the joint statement released after President Trump's meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi a year ago spoke quite specifically about the importance of counterterrorism cooperation. So this afternoon we'll be talking about the state of counterterrorism cooperation, as well as potential challenges that could perhaps stand in the way of deeper cooperation and what this all means for the broader region. And we have the perfect analyst, the perfect individual to lead this discussion. It is Dr. Amit Kumar. You should all have his very impressive bio in front of you, so I won't bore you with that. Amit will make an opening presentation, and then we will have plenty of time to have questions and a discussion. So with that, I give the floor to you, Amit.
First of all, thank you, Michael, and the Wilson Center for having me here. And it just struck me that the Wilson Center is almost as old as I am, and I hope that doesn't really give him my age.
I didn't mention which year we were established, though.
So thank you to all the attendees for sparing time to make it here. And I'll just split my presentation in 6 parts. First, I'm going to kind of assess or comment or discuss, rather, why we have a natural security partnership. That's what part of the title mentioned. Then the second question is there really a deepening of that partnership? And the third would be essentially to talk about the trends in U.S. India counterterrorism cooperation. I won't run a laundry list of all the happenings that would take eons. So I'm going to restrict myself to general trends and pick up the important nuggets of what's been transpiring over the last number of years, I would add. Then I'm going to comment a little about the future trends in counterterrorism cooperation for the future, how it's going to go and which way. Then I'm going to discuss the potential obstacles to deeper counterterrorism cooperation. And lastly, I'm going to very briefly go through the implications of this bilateral cooperation between U.S. and India on Pakistan and the broader South Asian region and even beyond. So why is this partnership a natural partnership? It's very aptly described in the title. India and the US are healthy democracies with adherence to common values like freedom, rule of law, liberty, and I would add the pursuit of happiness as well. Both countries' citizens have been victims of terrorist attacks. Take it 9/11, September 11, 2001, 26/11, November 26, 2008 in Mumbai, and 13/12, I would add, the attacks on the Indian Parliament back in 2001, soon after 9/11 here. Interestingly and sadly, I would add, 26/11 had US victims. We can't forget those heroes from the Chabad House in Mumbai who lost their lives for no reason. And 9/11 had Indian victims as well, both in New York and Washington. There are now emerging common perceptions regarding terrorist threats and urgent need to combat these threats. They are emerging perceptions, and they are congruent perceptions more and more as time goes by. There is a strong counterterrorism resolve of both the Trump and the Modi administrations, from the two leaders percolating downwards into their respective ministries, their national security councils, and so on and so forth. At all levels of the two administrations, there's healthy interaction on what we can do to solve the eternal conundrum of terrorism and what can we do to combat it. There is a realization now more and more, as I've been analyzing this over a period of time, that counterterrorism is an integral part of the overall security relationship between the two countries that encompasses defense, homeland security, and also increasingly cybersecurity. Last but not the least, the US and India are allies bonded by long cultural, business, and strategic ties. One can't emphasize enough the role of the Indian diaspora here in the US at all levels, be it in think tanks, be it within the administration, be it in business, CEOs, et cetera, a lot of advocacy groups which have really helped bring the relationship to where it is. So one can't really discount their importance and their phenomenal role in making this natural security partnership and making the two sides realize that it's really a natural security partnership. The second question that I ask myself is, has the partnership deepened? Now, has it progressed? Has it stayed the same? Has it deteriorated? My analysis tells me that it's progressed. The defense relationship more by leaps and bounds, about $4.5 billion of defense trade over the last 8 to 10 years, while the counterterrorism, homeland security dimension, and increasingly the cyber dimension is a little bit more recent. I would say more since the Mumbai attacks of 2008, but more since 2010, I would add, where institutional mechanisms were set, like the counterterrorism initiated between the two countries in 2010. So this has really progressed beyond, I would say, the imagination of people, because I remember delving in this issue about 4 years ago in something that I organized for the U.S. Impact. At that point of time, this was still kind of an important issue, but more and more, thanks to the Modi administration, increasingly the Trump administrations, thanks to the leadership of both the leaders and their administrations, everyone, as I said, up and down, the relationship in the counterterrorism dimension, Homeland Security broadly has really progressed. Now, what are the emerging trends in U.S. India counterterrorism cooperation? There's been a forward movement from intent to policy to processes to outcomes. So this is a continuum, really. It's difficult to say at which stage you have different aspects of the relationship, but more and more there is an earnest desire and an earnestness about both countries coming to some tangible outcomes. For example, Michael correctly alluded to intelligence sharing on terrorist financing threats, on individuals and organizations that fund terror. There is also the signing of the Homeland Security Presidential Directive 6 by India, where terrorist screening information between the two countries is shared. So this is, and of course, Michael also very rightly mentioned the discussion on sanctions beginning December last year. And that's become a very important part because as you may be hearing or have heard in the news, that the government of India has been trying hard to get the UN to list Masood Azhar and his accomplices for a long, long time. But so more and more, there is this issue with the 1267 of the Al-Qaeda sanctions regime of not only listing, but implementation also. So more and more discussion is extending now to implementation of sanctions, not just listing of sanctions, because what is listing? Listing is mere naming and shaming, but unless the assets are actually frozen or confiscated, the implementation metrics has to be made available in order to really show that the sanctions are working. And more there is, I imagine, I've written about it, I've spoken about it back in India too, that discussion on the 1373 sanctions regime, which deals with national sanctions regimes. India doesn't have individuals listed in its national sanction regime. It only has organizations. So how do the US and India work together to make sure that there is movement on not just 1267 implementation issues, actual freezing of assets, confiscation of assets, or seizing of assets, but also more the national listings or the supranational listings. One can't really ignore or overemphasize the prominence of India's role in the Trump administration's South Asian strategy and the US national security strategy, where the Indian role in Afghanistan has been appreciated, the economic reconstruction, and the training to the Afghan National Police and the Afghan Army, and also dealing, well, the Indian help that the US has sought, India has acceded to arrange for the delivery of Soviet-made weapons to the government of Afghanistan, because the US directly itself or any of its NATO partners cannot possibly sell that equipment to Afghanistan. So India has played a very handy role over the last 8 to 10 years on that as well. Very important point to note is there's been a strategic shift in US thinking on India's counterterrorism needs. Earlier, many Indians thought, or the government of India as well thought, that the US is only interested in selling defense equipment and so on, the Boeings of the world, Lockheed Martins. But more and more, there's a realization within India that the US really is interested in counterterrorism cooperation, where you deal with terrorists, the good Taliban, the bad Taliban, the Lashkar-e-Taibas of the world, the Jaish-e-Mohammed of the world, the Hizbul Mujahideens of the world, along with the Haqqani networks of the world, as well as the Afghan Taliban, and all groups across the board that are Al-Qaeda associated, both groups as well as individuals and entities. During 2016, the US and Indian officials exchanged terrorist threat information in intelligence and law enforcement channels to enhance the capacity for addressing use of internet for terrorism purposes, and to assist Indian investigators in terrorism-related cases. So greater cooperation between the investigating agencies as well as the intelligence agencies between the two countries is more in vogue now. And this is also helped by the fact that the national security councils in both countries are led by individuals, strong individuals who are really pros and professionals in intelligence and law enforcement. So that is something that has been a big change over the last 4 years or so, ever since the Modi administration assumed office. The bilateral cooperation has intensified with both countries acceding to each other's aspirations. We've been reading about the Office of Foreign Assets Control, Treasury sanctions of South Asian terrorist groups and individuals. There was the sanctions dialogue at the risk of repetition in 2017. That just got kicked off, and I spoke a little about that. The charter of the U.S. India working groups on counterterrorism is expanding. Violent extremism and ISIS, banning, proscribing ISIS, are a little new to the Indian lingua. But India has taken strong note of the US's needs in that regard and has proscribed ISIS back in 2014 February, and also changed the Internal Security Department one between in the Ministry of Home Affairs in New Delhi has been rechristened Counterterrorism, Counter-Radicalization. So counterterrorism, counter-radicalization means violent extremism and radicalization are important issues that the government of India is gripping with, though actually only about 100 Indians have left India to participate in the ISIS jihad in the Middle East. But still taking note of Indian concern, US concerns, and US simultaneously taking note of Indian concerns. And the US support to India at the UN is something that's been there for quite a while, dating back to the earliest listings in the Al-Qaeda sanctions regime in 2003, I assume, Lashkar-e-Taiba, 2005, Dawood Ibrahim, and then 2008, the US again took a lead. Of course, much against China's wishes, but China acceded in 2008 too, right after the 26/11 attacks by Lashkar-e-Taiba in Mumbai. The cooperation at the now also the Hizbul Mujahideen was sanctioned or was designated by the State Department as a foreign terrorist organization right after Prime Minister Modi's visit in 2017. So that's something that's very important. And there have been, for a number of years now, joint army counterterrorism exercises, Yuddha Abhyas, for example, from last year. So that's been something both on the army side, the law enforcement side, the intelligence side, and the paramilitary side. The cooperation of the multilateral regime has continued to flourish with the US's support for India's membership of the Counterterrorism Committee way back in 2010. And the US was among the first to support. There was one mission I've heard that wasn't really interested in that, India assuming that role, and that's only the mission, but then they had some orders from the top, from headquarters in their respective capitals, and that was really sought, and that was okayed finally. But the US has been front and center of designations, whether it's the OFAC or UN designations. Repeated US support for the designation of Masood Azhar. And also, more recently, there's been a close working relationship with India at the Financial Action Task Force. So you see a movement from the listing mechanisms to more the financial tools of the Financial Action Task Force. And India became a full member of the Financial Action Task Force in June 2010, which sort of coincided almost with the institution of the counterterrorism initiative between the two countries. That was signed by Ambassador Romer and Home Secretary then G.K. Pillai, whom I had the honor of meeting in one of my trips in India a few years back. And of course, Congressman Romer, we all know, being a member of the 9/11 Commission, very security focused. There is definitely, as I mentioned earlier, a cooperation and a congruence on Afghanistan, thanks to the common perception of threats posed by the Taliban and their patrons. US troops and Indian economic developmental aid, Indian training, and like I said earlier, the assistance through delivery of certain Russian-era made weapons and spare parts and equipment to the Afghan government by India at the instance of the US. The anti-terrorism assistance training program by the U.S. State Department has trained 1,100 Indian police service officers. And interestingly, over the last some years, a year or so, there's been a broadening of the course mix, moving to maritime security and to cybersecurity, beyond the hostage taking and the crime investigation scene stuff, to important to note in the context of the rechristening of the U.S. Pacific Command to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So you see maritime security assuming a very important role, as has cyber. The counterterrorism cooperation integrated into defense and overall security cooperation. That's a very important part. Hitherto, they were more separate or segmented, but now there's an integrated approach more and more, with both the armies from both sides and the law enforcement agencies and the intelligence agencies participating in the overall security matrix, I would call it, which includes defense, cyber, homeland security, and counterterrorism. You had the Maritime Security Quad, which is a quadrilateral between India, the US, Japan, and Australia. You have the Malabar exercises, the participation of Japan along the US and India, Navy exercises. And of course, I wouldn't say there's a shift in cooperation from the US, UN to FATF, but at both places. FATF is turning out to be a little bit more effective, so the Indian government hopes, I would imagine, than the UN, because the UN, there was only this clamor for listing Masood Azhar, and China would keep on vetoing it, even as early as this year, I guess, early this year. We've heard about the suspension of coalition support funds and foreign military financing to Pakistan by the US Congress. This is more to do with their perceived inaction on the Haqqani network and the Afghan Taliban front in terms of doing enough to sort of run their writ over those two groups. Does it help India? In a sense, it does help India, because the way India sees this is all these groups are Al-Qaeda associated, and you have the presence of Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed and these so-called India-centric groups in Indian embassy attacks in Kabul as well. So they're all part of a mosaic of terrorist groups who on one side are anti-Indian, on the other side are anti-Afghan. And in both situations, the US is not really helped if there is not much action against any one of these groups, from the Afghan side, because US troops are present there, and from the Indian side, because US and India, as we are discussing, the theme of this talk is more enhanced cooperation across the board. India's initiatives in regional cooperation or counterterrorism cooperation are more broad sweeping. You have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have the BRICS relationship, and you have other bilateral cooperation initiatives. To use Michael's words, this is the flavor of the season, counterterrorism cooperation. I would call it a la mode. That kind of reminds me of ice cream, but we'll leave it for another time. The Indian, well, what are the future trends in US-India counterterrorism cooperation? As the defense relationship prospers, the counterterrorism cooperation will mirror it as part of the intensified bilateral security dynamic. We're already seeing this happening, but in coming years, I expect a more enhanced, more robust overall security relationship, spanning all the security dimensions, as I said earlier. The rechristening of the erstwhile US Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command brings the possibility of bilateral security cooperation in not only defense matters, whether it's anti-submarine warfare or naval exercises or naval readiness, but also, and this essentially relates to managing the ostensible Chinese dominance of the South China Sea lanes and the multi-trillion-dollar commerce flows, but also to intensified counterterrorism cooperation related to the non-traditional security threats, like counterterrorism, terrorism, money laundering, or terrorist financing, or drug trafficking. Across the Indo-Pacific, from the Maldives to Nepal to Bangladesh to Sri Lanka to the ASEAN countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines. India and the US already have strong bilateral relationships with most of these countries. So if they could join hands in terms of pooling their technical expertise to ASEAN countries and to India's land neighbors as well, like Bangladesh and Nepal, and also a close sea neighbor, Sri Lanka, that would enhance potentially the cooperation dynamic in terms of joint counterterrorism capacity building exercises. This can obviously extend to the Central Asian republics too, because India has strong cultural relationships and strong geopolitical diplomatic relationships with the Central Asian republics too. So that could be one more facet or focus area as far as the counterterrorism, the joint bilateral counterterrorism cooperation capacity building exercises extending to third countries and regions. What are the potential obstacles to deeper counterterrorism cooperation? There's a difference in perception regarding terrorist threats. US understandably is more concerned about the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Haqqani network, where Indian concerns relate to Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the D Company, and Hizbul Mujahideen. But that's now getting bridged. Those disparities are getting bridged with time more and more. And when I say potential obstacles, these have been obstacles, and they are no longer that much obstacles, some, to kind of coin my own word, now because of the changing relationship. There was the inability to convince the US that Haqqani, Taliban, and the LAT, JUM, and HUM are all associated with Al-Qaeda and are joined at the hip, as I mentioned earlier. But the US probably is seeing more and more that reality sinking in. There is the potential Afghan reconciliation with the Taliban and the impact on the activities of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and Hizbul Mujahideen, what impact that would have on India. So India does have legitimate concerns on that regard as well. There is a difference in perceptions regarding who state sponsors of terrorism are. So both the Indians obviously do not participate in the military anti-ISIS coalition. And the US has genuine political, logistical bottlenecks as far as action against Pakistan is concerned, because access to the US troops in Afghanistan is through Pakistan. So that's a legitimate problem that the US faces. And the other concern has been that the cooperation has been mired more in optics and processes rather than outcomes, despite the US's best efforts. LET continues its activity unabated. With the bounty, the US bounty on Hafiz Syed, 6 years old and counting, and not much has happened there. The OFAC sanctions do not, the sanctioned individuals and entities do not have bank accounts in US banks. So how effective are the OFAC sanctions and the UN sanctions against the India-centric groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, both the individuals as well as the entities and the like? And of course, the 2611 trial is going nowhere, despite almost 9.5 and 10 years counting. None of the accused has been prosecuted or convicted, or much less sentenced. So that's always been a concern from the Indian side, and for those who want a stronger US-India counterterrorism relationship. The one point of recent discord, I wouldn't say discord, dissonance would be the right word, is the alleged infiltration of the Lashkar-e-Taiba into the Rakhine province of Myanmar. The government of India believes that there is a Lashkar-e-Taiba infiltration in Myanmar, in the Rakhine province, whereas the US views the issue in terms of atrocities, disruption, and human rights abuses against the Rohingyas. So that's been something which probably the two countries may not see eye to eye. There is, of course, as I touched upon it briefly earlier, the perception in the Indian mind that the US is more interested in defense cooperation and not that much in counterterrorism cooperation until recently. So that's been dispelled to a large degree. Needless to say, both countries have their own supreme national interests, and it's hard for national interests to sort of coincide or concur exactly. There are always bound to be issues where people may not see eye to eye. So the strategic, commercial, and security interest of the two countries may diverge. Example, the international north-south transportation corridor through Iran and Russia that India has been involved in. And of course, the U.S. sanctions against Russia and Iran. Now, that's something that the government of India and the U.S. do not see eye to eye, because again, the disparity or the degree of convergence or congruence in the security and economic and commercial aspects will make it difficult for the two countries to sort of have the exact same views on different parts of the world because they have different needs. What are the implications, lastly, of the U.S. India counterterrorism cooperation on Pakistan and the broader South Asian region? Pakistan's recent grey listing by the Financial Action Task Force ostensibly is the result of joint U.S. and Indian efforts, and Pakistan's frantic and frenetic efforts to avoid this listing, and the neutrality of China's stance at the Financial Task Force is an obvious implication of this heightened, intensified counterterrorism cooperation between the two countries. And China was given a very interesting SOP. It was made the vice president of the Financial Action Task Force. So you see negotiations and diplomatic approaches being fruitful. U.S. and India are allies on countering terrorism and promoting peace, security, development, and reconstruction in Afghanistan, and that's good for U.S., Indian, and Afghan national interests. Be it the national security strategy or the Trump or President Trump's policy towards Afghanistan, which is extended from being an AFPAC strategy to more of an India involving South Asian strategy. So you see the importance of counterterrorism cooperation there. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. and India can work with Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal on their respective counterterrorism efforts. U.S.-India counterterrorism cooperation could also extend beyond South Asia to ASEAN countries. And when you bring in maritime security and the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and it could also increase, there could be heightened cooperation in the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, which is the East African coast, right from Somalia down to Mozambique, Kenya. There is a lot of jihadi, either ISIS or Al-Qaeda linked to their own indigenous kind of jihadi movements there. And India and the US can cooperate in terms of capacity building on the non-traditional security threat side, in addition to the maritime cooperation that we're starting witnessing more and more. So just keeping an eye on the South China Sea would be a little bit myopic in my sense. It's good to extend it to non-traditional security threats across the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific as well as the Pacific, through the Straits of Malacca and the ASEAN countries and beyond. The US and India need to work together towards implementation and real impact of sanctions and other capacity counterterrorism measures at international multilateral fora like the 1267 Committee of the UN, the Al-Qaeda Taliban Monitoring Team, as well as the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. While FATF, as we've seen, is a little bit more proactive and gung-ho, the UN has been a little bit slow. So I think the US and India should kind of raise this issue at the UN to improve the efficacy of the work of both the Al-Qaeda Taliban Monitoring Team as well as the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. Just keeping it as an appendage of the UN Secretariat or just a moribund part of the Secretariat will not do, because important resource constraints do underscore the need to kind of spruce up the working of organs at the UN as well. So that's it for now. Thank you again. Thank you to all of you for sparing your time and attending this, and it's been a pleasure addressing you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was really a terrific presentation, very insightful and extremely comprehensive to the point that many of the questions I was going to ask you have already been answered by you. But I will, before we get to you all, because I imagine there'll be some questions and comments, I just wanted to maybe pose one or two questions to you. And the first one is a case of hoping that you could perhaps bring some substance to what to this point remains speculation more than anything else, so far as I know. As you had noted before, there's been an increase in momentum toward more defense, toward more arms sales. And over the last few years, we've been hearing reports about the possibility of the United States providing drone technology to India, including Predator drone technology, which of course India would be able to use for counterterrorism purposes. So wanted to know if you had any comments about that, what you know about that, if you think that would be a good idea for those types of sales to go through. That's the first question. I guess the second question is a broader one. Trying to think of the way to phrase it. Basically, if you could look at how the broader U.S. India partnership is structured and look at how you have certain types of disconnects. And particularly what I'm talking about here is, to my view, India and the U.S. haven't really settled on a common definition for what should constitute a truly strategic partnership. I think that India emphasizes technology transfers, arms sales, things like that. The United States emphasizes those types of elements as well in a strategic partnership, but it also looks to its strategic partners to actually be getting involved in operational type activities. So you had highlighted before how India has declined to participate in the anti-ISIS coalition. So I guess the question here is, how do some of these disconnects, these definitional disconnects in the broader relationship affect, or how could they affect U.S.-India counterterrorism cooperation?
Well, I'll start with the second question first, if I may. And since someone who just got married, and I always used to joke about marriage as a common minimum program that's supposed to last a lifetime, as far as coalition politics is concerned, there are incongruent views on all those issues that you discussed, but given its relationships with folks in the Middle East, India has to walk a tightrope and be like more of a diplomatic / political trapeze artist, for lack of a better term, to make sure that its interests and its relationships in the Middle East are not damaged or affected adversely, doing, I would say, the bidding of the U.S. as far as participation in ISIS is concerned, the anti-ISIS coalition is concerned. So the government of India has, as I said earlier, proscribed ISIS in February 2014 under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is the equivalent of the Foreign Terrorist Organization here in the U.S. by the State Department. It has rechristened its internal security office as counterterrorism, counter-radicalization. And more, there is a realization that the, and this is witnessed by tons of conferences and think tanks, some of whom I've been associated with also, focusing more on counter-radicalization and violent extremism. So there is a congruence insofar as the organizational restructuring is concerned. But as I said earlier, India's mortally security, commercial interests, and diplomatic interests do not always allow it to take a lead in adopting military postures against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the like. Even in Afghanistan, India has not participated in boots on the ground efforts. Insofar as the first question is concerned, you're very right that would be welcome, because drones can be employed both in homeland security, counterterrorism, as well as defense, and there are Navy drones also, which can be employed against Navy powers and also. And interestingly enough, here in the US, most of the defense manufacturers, the systems integrators, are also producers of homeland security equipment. So there is a genuine interest in sort of ratcheting up the penetration in that market. So it would be good, but then again, there may be cost constraints, there may be political concerns, and the like. But there is an earnest desire, as far as I can guess, in India to further the defense relationship, and as I said, extend it to an overall security, where not just heavy equipment and machines and arms, but also extended, as we've seen through the joint army exercise, or the Malabar exercises, or the RIMPAC exercises more recently, as we speak. The cross-detailing of personnel, or the interoperability of equipment, or the technology transfer. And of course, a part of it is also the current Indian government's strong resolve to go in for made in India. How much can be made in India and how much can be bought? The eternal make or buy production management conundrum that plagues every company. How is it really cost effective to make it here? And do we get the current technology, or we do get a dated technology? Because F-16s is more like a relatively dated technology. So when in that product life cycle, when the production of F-16 stops here, can they be built in India or elsewhere? So those are all important political, diplomatic, commercial constraints, cost constraints, as well as political discussions. It would be heartening to have more, but I think we are at that stage where trust building and confidence building, and Secretary Pompeo's and Secretary Mattis's testimony before the U.S. Congress on giving India a national security waiver in the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. So that's a real deal, as the president would say, where you are giving an exemption or a national security waiver to India because of an otherwise thriving relationship. And we haven't even touched about the fact that most of the Fortune 500 companies are already in India, and we have Indian CEOs of many. I was just coming here, and I just saw the chief financial officer is from India, of General Motors, out of all companies, which used to be the primary U.S. Company to go to many years ago, still is, as a matter of fact. So those are my views on what you asked me. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Excellent. So let's go to you all now, and I would just like to make a few requests. One, if you could wait until you have a microphone in front of you before you pose your question. Just it may seem odd in a room like this, so why would you need a microphone? But we are live streaming this event on our website and also via Facebook Live, so we wouldn't want those people to miss out on your brilliant questions. And also, if you could give your name and affiliation, just so we know who you all are. So we'll start right over here, Sally, on this side of the room.
Hi there. You may or may not have touched on this earlier in your presentation, but since I had dropped in a little late, but want to ask you about the technology transfer, which Michael talked about, and the FDI and the defense relationship. We saw in 2016 that in 15 sectors, FDI was opened up to full 100%. Before that, it was only in 49, and defense was one of those sectors that underwent those changes. But one thing that was a caveat of that was that during the days when it was 49%, for 49% FDI, for a company to invest fully with that 49%, the technology transfer would have to be a technology of state-of-the-art technology. Whereas in 2016, when it came to 100%, it'd have to be modern technology to ensure that the company would be allowed to invest 100% FDI. So those terms are very vague, which a lot of commentators have said. But still, there seems to be a lot of prospects for U.S. India defense cooperation. So do you see the FDI climate changing? And if so, for the better with less vaguer terms, Will that increase the cooperation on other parts of the security partnership?
Good question.
I would say that can I answer? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I would say that the exigencies of the Made in India political proclivity of the Indian government currently is going to be the preeminent issue to the extent that there is need for employment generation in India, big need right now. And we are witnessing the 5th year of the Modi administration. There is an urgent need to sort of boost employment, and there is a genuine need of Made in India as far as the Modi administration is concerned. That's going to be an important issue going forward as well. And now, that doesn't necessarily slow down FDI, but we're talking of huge commitments of money and huge transfers of technology. Now, the Lockheed Martin production of F-16 is a classic example. When the F-16 productions are phased out here in Georgia, I think they had the last, if I'm not mistaken, the last factory, and that's set to begin in India, for example. That's a classic example where India may not want to go in for F-35s, but can do with F-16s, as long as they're indigenously manufactured in India. So I think reconciling the need for more FDI with Made in India is an important aspect as far as India is concerned right now. Yeah.
Okay, let's go right here.
Hello, I'm Madeline Sides with the Annenberg Trust at Sunnylands. As you discussed, India is obviously walking that political and diplomatic tightrope between the U.S., regional nations, and just their interests. However, you also discussed that it's possible in the future that U.S. and India security partnership would broaden and open up to other regional nations. How would you see that working practically, given the strategic interests of both nations are sometimes in conflict, particularly in those areas?
As I said, that is more something that I am suggesting at this point of time. I'm not sure how much of that is practically happening. To the extent that that helps kind of both countries, because the U.S. has interest in ASEAN in promoting, and I know General Mattis has been having discussions at the Shangri-La dialogue recently with the U.S.'s ASEAN partners, the Philippines and the like, Indonesia. And the Indian policy is not just look east, but act east policy. 10 ASEAN countries assembled to celebrate India's Republic Day in January of this year. And India has definitely got cultural ties also, a very strong historical cultural ties, in addition to strategic ties. So that's potentially one area in which the counterterrorism cooperation or the non-traditional threat, countering non-traditional threat partnership could expand, where both countries has exceptional security personnel, have great training, have great experiences in homeland security and counterterrorism, have great aspirations to cooperate and collaborate. And that could be something that both countries could extend to ASEAN, to Eastern Africa, and also to the SCO countries, the 5 Central Asian republics, 4 of whom are members of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So that's more aspirational at this point of time, but I see, given the fact that there is a healthy congruence in at least the bilateral aspirations, and that could probably overlap to make it trilateral, if possible. Yeah.
Okay, I guess we'll go there to the back, and then we'll come to the other side of the room.
Dr. Mike Flanagan of Flanagan Consulting. It's a pleasure to see you again, Doctor. It's always a
Likewise.
tremendous presentation by you. Is it possible that in the near future, the future of U.S. India relations that would survive a Modi and a Trump relationship, the relationship would survive those 2 administrations 10, 20 years from now, could be built on the cooperation that you suggest on a very deep level? India, if I'm not mistaken, pushes into the marketplace 27 million new college graduates every year that need to be employed. I mean, that's an amazing number for the United States couldn't absorb that level of new employees, and it's an economy that's much larger than India's. If there were the transference of the work, of the jobs, of the industry, even in legacy industries like the F-16 or many others that could go as well, would that be enough to form an informal and long-lasting quid pro quo to involve India as the first, not the junior partner, but the first partner in regional security issues that would extend from Afghanistan and Africa, which is very troublesome for the world, and there's no big brother there at all, and of course looking east as well?
Insofar as the, great question by the way, Michael, insofar as the non-traditional security threats are concerned, yes. In terms of taking the lead in the military efforts, I don't think so. India would want to take the lead for understandable reasons.
Yes, right here.
My name is Tom Dine, and I've had many years' involvement in South Asian issues. I even served in the American Embassy before you were born.
Oh my God, that's quite that's quite some time back now.
Well,
guess.
I understand that, but the idea of counterterrorism cooperation on a bilateral basis was never part of the 1960s.
Right.
Having said that, you barely touched on Iran, and this is a political question, obviously. Can you dig deeply into the Iranian-Indian relationship on counterterrorism and defense-related issues?
Well, I would combine the two and make it strategic, which involves security and economic and commercial. Now, one case in point, just to take a small case study, would be the port of Chabahar, which is not too far from the port of Gwadar. And India would definitely want to boost its trade and seek an alternate trade route through the Iranian Chabahar port, which would help Afghanistan, the Central Asian republics, and Russia, and countries in Eurasia. So that's a pure commercial consideration, as well as a strategic consideration, because of the obstruction to overflight endeavors through Pakistan. So it's economic and it is security, both. And whether you look at the SCO or you look at other countries, other kind of, one case in point is the international North-South transport corridor, which is operational now. And there, again, the security considerations and the strategic considerations merge. As far as defense, I would not like to comment on that. But as far as strategic is concerned, which includes security and commercial, I would say those are important considerations. This is just one example, essentially. But that is one country or one scenario where the US and India have different interests. And that will not coincide. And as I said earlier about marriage, it's a minimum common program that's supposed to last a lifetime. So back to Michael's question, it will last a lifetime. And the extent of overlap and amicable sorting out of issues and agreeing to disagree is a very healthy part of any relationship. So that's an important consideration. Delving deeper into Iran, there may be cultural ties also as well. But I think India and Iran both are governed by their supreme national interests, which at the risk of further repetition is strategic as well as commercial. Yeah.
And to complement your very good points, I think to underscore energy is so important in this case.
It is.
Given the critical relationship between India and Iran in the energy context, India is a top buyer of Iranian energy, and India wants to become a more gas-driven economy, and it has intentions of raising its gas consumption by a sizable amount in the next few years. I don't know the exact amount, but Iran, of course, is a key source of gas. We talk about Iran. What about Saudi Arabia? What about India's relationship with Saudi Arabia?
India's relationship with Saudi Arabia is also cordial and is a strong relationship, both in terms of the oil trade, as you mentioned, but also strategically, because India doesn't see its relationship in terms of being friends with a Shia superpower or a regional power, I would add, and a Sunni superpower. It only sees its own interests. Oil, you mentioned very correctly, is one important. The rights of passage also are important to the Persian Gulf. But the relationship, to the best of my knowledge, is pretty strong and solid. And interestingly enough, Prime Minister Modi has not only succeeded in having visits and solid relationships like his administration with practically everyone in the Middle East, but also made separate trips to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and has benefited. And I think no one is complaining about that because of the fact that India's adroit political diplomacy, thanks to Prime Minister Modi and his administration. But like I said, it starts from the man at the top and it percolates downwards. Has been very able and adroit, for lack of a better term.
Okay, we'll go right here.
Phil Schrafer, retired international healthcare consultant. My last assignment was the health advisor to the U.S. Embassy in Turkmenistan. First of all, to thank you, did a very unusual thing. You went around and introduced yourself one-on-one, if I may call you Amit.
You can call me whatever.
Okay. Could you put on your United Nations hat? I want to just focus on Afghanistan, if I could. I go to another nearby think tank, and I'm going to reflect. First of all, comment and then the question. The comment is that the U.S. has really stopped playing a peace role in Afghanistan because it's been largely a military role. The State Department has had turnover in leadership and, of course, decimated in terms of numbers. The question is, I understand Modi has been meeting with the Chinese about a possible role in Afghanistan. If you could elaborate on that. And the other part of the question is, can peace ever be achieved in Afghanistan without foreign military presence?
Great questions, both of them. As far as Prime Minister Modi's olive branch to the Chinese, that's dictated by, I would say, India's needs at this present point of time, because you can't have an antagonizing relationship on the naval side with the same power. You had the Chinese incursion into Doklam, which was resolved peacefully. And India and China have a very strong trade relationship that's expanding as well. So I think adroit diplomacy and able political leadership makes a very heady cocktail, which Prime Minister Modi has engineered and engendered, I would add, as far as China is concerned. Again, it's a little bit of political and diplomatic heft and trapeze walking, but I think India has done pretty well there. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, without foreign powers, we saw the U.S. retracting in the 1980s, and through the 1990s, Afghanistan could hold its own. There were foreign powers and other guises there, creating trouble. And you see the rise of the Taliban and what it's done to the wonderful, peace-loving, great American people, Afghan folks, and all the people that we've lost in Afghanistan as well. So India has played a certain limited role in Afghanistan, which is more reconstruction, development, training, and delivery of certain Soviet equipment. It's done its bit there. And it has no agenda or no plans, I guess, to ever have boots on the ground in Afghanistan. And we keep hearing about the concept of strategic depth, who maintains strategic depth in Afghanistan. India has a historical, if you look at the Buddha statues in Bamiyan, for example, and the fact that the Taliban destroyed them in 2001. Now, India being the land of the Buddha, Buddhism spread far and wide through Southeast Asia, Thailand, even in China to some extent, as also in Afghanistan. So the cultural, historic links are not just limited to Bollywood movies and Bollywood songs, but they are institutionalized in the love and affection that people have for each other, whether it's India versus the Afghans or India versus the Central Asians. Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and all the Central Asian republics. You have, interestingly, you have participants from the Central Asian republics participating in Indian TV shows, and I've seen some of them. The kind of thrill that they get from singing a Bollywood song is really amazing, you know. So it's good to see culture doing its bit also, and cultural diplomacy, as I think, is a very strong Indian suit, you know.
So, you know, we've hit on so many hot button countries: Iran, China, Afghanistan. I'm not going to ask you to comment on this one, especially since I think we've maybe gone over further afield more than we should have. But Russia, another very interesting case. Clearly, you know, from a CT lens, both India and Russia share a concern about ISIS. But for all this talk about the growth of the U.S. India partnership, you know, Russia is still a very important friend of India. And I think Prime Minister Modi a few years ago made a very striking comment. It was about 2 or 3 years ago. He said something to the effect of, if you ask a little Indian boy on the street what his best friend is, he'll always say Russia. That was a very striking comment. Anyway, I think there was a question right in the back over here. Yes.
How would you characterize the relationship between civilians and security forces in the Kashmir region, and what is the impact of that relationship on India's broader security goals with regard to Pakistan?
Can you please repeat your question again? I didn't hear the first part correctly.
How would you characterize the relationship between civilians and security forces in the Kashmir region? And what is the impact of that relationship on India's broader strategic goals with Pakistan?
Well, the broader strategic goals against Pakistan are essentially confined to the alleged terror sanctuaries within Pakistan of India-centered groups and the cross-border infiltration of those groups into India. So that's I think the main thing. I mean, most people talk about should India and Pakistan talk with each other and resolve it. I think the first thing, even before they every time they've talked, nothing has happened. So the basis for dialogue or talk would be resolution of the infiltration of terrorist groups across the border. The relationship between the security forces and the people in Kashmir is okay, as far as I'm concerned, based on my read of the situation. It's sometimes accentuated to show it's bad, but the Indian security forces are only acting against the terrorists in Kashmir. They don't bore any ill will to the people of Kashmir. The people of Kashmir are essentially the people of India. People of Jammu and Kashmir are like the people of India. Anyone else from India. So the police is doing their job to weed out terrorism from within the valley, and not ganging up or targeting civilians at all. You know, contrary to what's repeatedly shown or displayed in the media by certain interests who don't want peace in the valley or in India, or do not even want peace between India and Pakistan, I would add. You know. And when I say that, I'm talking not just the international media, but also media from both within Pakistan and India.
Yeah, Kashmir, of course, is a complex and fraught issue, and one could have had a whole separate seminar to answer your very good question. Let's go right over here. You're good? Okay. Yep, right here.
Good afternoon. I'm Lee Roberts. I teach American Security Policy and Law and Ethics of War at George Mason University, and my current research is an attempt to assess the efficacy or lack thereof of Pakistani conventional firepower procurement. The Research and Analysis Wing is a favorite villain of Pakistan. It stands accused of lots of things, some fantastic and some a little bit more compelling. Among those that seem to have a little bit more compelling evidence are either direct or indirect, whether through the Afghan NDS or through other proxies, facilitation of Afghan haven for the TTP and for operations of Baloch separatists in southwest Pakistan, where in key construction areas of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. My question is, given the recent warming of relations between India and China, or at least the opportunity or the opening thereof, are we likely to see, despite the fact that there are clear strategic benefits with regard to balancing Pakistan for India, are we likely to see India avoid such proxy facilitation operations, direct or indirect, in the future? And would the calculus be more for counterterrorism cooperation or more for improving relations with India?
When you say counterterrorism cooperation, you're talking about China?
No, with the United States, since it has an interest in reducing the capabilities of militant groups in both Afghanistan and across the border in Pakistan.
In my view, the counterterrorism contribution to the Afghan war theater, if I use the word, as far as India is concerned, is going to remain what it is, which is, I repeat again, reconstruction and economic development, training of the Afghan national security personnel, the delivery of Soviet-era made weapons and their spare parts and ammunition. So that is something that's going to remain. I don't see it extending very much beyond that to involve other, either active participation or any other aspect, you know. So the involvement will be limited to that, you know. China and India have talked about collaborating as far as Afghan economic development is concerned, but that remains to be seen. That's an idea that was discussed at the recent meeting between Prime Minister and President Xi. I think it was in Wuhan, if I'm not mistaken. I keep on kind of gobbling my Chinese words. I mean, except when it comes to Kung Pao chicken, there I'm pretty clear. All the rest I keep on scrambling. But I think that's something that remains to be seen on how much traction that would get, because obviously China, the CPEC is something that the Indians are very much against, because it goes through Pakistan administered Kashmir. Or Pakistan occupied Kashmir, as almost everyone in India believes. So I don't see that very much beyond the collaboration, cooperation, reconstruction concern. How that is fleshed out, what will be the modalities of cooperation, remains to be seen. It's too early right now to comment.
I think just that first part of your question is an important one. If we're trying to apply a regional lens to this discussion today, this question of whether Afghan intel forces are providing support to Pakistan-focused terrorists, it's clearly something that Afghanistan will say is not going on. But this is a very strongly held view by the Pakistanis, particularly given that the incidents of terrorism are down in Pakistan over the last few years, but it does appear that most of those attacks that have happened in Pakistan have been carried out by militant groups with a presence in Afghanistan. So it's a good point to make. Are there any other questions? Okay, to the back of the room one more time.
Hi, my name is Vibhav Upadhyay. I lead a foundation called India Center Foundation, which has worked bringing India and Japan together to run a framework. So my question is in a form of a question and also a suggestion too, because his great work is on security. That what I find missing between India and America, which my foundation is also working now to how we can do that, is architectural, mismatch, because to be very frank, India was part of that larger development part where it was exploited, not exploiter, Okay, for years and years, this mismatch happened only recently in say 20 years or after Pokhran, we can say the relationship have changed. So the defense we are talking about, or my question to you is, are you considering the ideology behind the security, the system behind security? I see the system and products happening, but ideology is still not matching in India and America. And so my question to your work is that, are you considering addressing the ideology part of that or not?
Yeah, the anti-radical ideology, as I mentioned earlier, both through the institution of the Home Ministry in India and the State Department here, adding the word countering violent extremism or counter-radicalization in the Indian context shows that work is going on towards that. At least we are in the beginnings of that right now. And also the ideology, I would say, is more counterterrorism. Bad guys are bad guys, whether they're good terrorists or bad terrorists. All terrorists are bad. That's right. And I would also like to add something to your great work on Japan. So, first of all, thank you for that. In revving up the Indo-Japanese bilateral relationship, the extension of the India-Japan-Africa growth corridor, if the U.S. can participate there, that's going to be another important suggestion, which I had. I just skipped going through that, but I had that in my mind. I'm glad you raised it. And if they can work in the Malabar exercises, or they can work as part of a quad involving Australia as well, they might as well work in Africa, because these are three countries that see the world in much the same way, be it military or counterterrorism or cybersecurity. And they are three countries that are friendly with each other, and there I see the start of a very long standing trilateral relationship, as I was mentioning. Obviously, Japan doesn't see the kind of terrorism that Southeast Asia sees, but the three countries, i.e. Japan, India, and the US, can work in different regions of the world as part of a trilateral effort.
So I would like to add to that Africa initiative you just said. So Foundation's new initiative is basically India, Japan, Africa. And it is not three regions coming together. It is the operating system we have made, the new operating system we have made for development in Asia. So we are trying to connect Africa to that. And before that, we need to connect America to that,
Absolutely.
Because that connect is right now missing, but we are working very hard that this connect can happen. And last, terrorism, from our perspective, is a disease, is a symptom. It's not the root cause. The root cause is somewhere deep, somewhere we have made mistakes in the past. So we realize, and then we try to deal the problem which was outcome of ideology, deal with it ideology. Military is not solution only. That's one solution, like when you are sick, you take to suppress symptoms also. That's a good thing to do. But you have to also address from where the sickness has come.
The ideology, you're right, you need countering violent extremism and counter-radicalization. But in many cases, the ideology is forced down the throat by countries per se. It's not always individuals who do it. Countries spend money to radicalize youth. Countries get into, through their agents or representatives, get into prisons and cause the radicalization of. So there is a counter-radicalization and a de-radicalization effort absolutely essential. But again, insofar as just the military solution is not the solution, just curing the ideology solution is not the only solution. You need a mix of, as I say, outreach, regulation, sanctions, and a bit of military also. These days, we are really fond of sanctions, but again, my whole pet peeve with sanctions is where are the outcomes? Are you really squeezing the funders of terrorism? Or are you just doing the name and shame? I mean, they're named, but they aren't shamed. I mean, they're shameless. So how much can you do? So I think this is a disease. You're very right. Terrorism that has many different kind of mitigative aspects to it. One of which is definitely deregulation, but not the only one.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Great. Well, I think this has been a terrific discussion, terrific presentation, terrific questions, and I think that Amit, you got a lot of questions that went well beyond the focus of the main discussion. I think you did a great job answering them, and this was really great. So if everyone could join me for another round of applause for Amit. Thanks a lot. We will release you into the sunshine. So thank you. We're adjourned.
Thank you, Michael, and again, thanks to the Wilson Center and all of you for attending. Thank you.